Hello, my name is Will Lucas. I'm proud to present another East Coast surf documentary. This time we are looking at mid-1960s surfing in New England. While others were already entering the surf business at the time, one entrepreneur, Will Summers, secured the Hobie dealership for the entire region. While Will's career in the surf business lasted only through those golden years, his influence on surfing through marketing, contests, magazine articles, surf teams, and fights to keep beaches open had a positive impact on many young people. His iconic Hobie Hearse was known from Connecticut to Maine. I was honored to have made contact and interviewed some of the surfers who worked with Will in some capacity during that time. Ron Pottery from Salem, Massachusetts, Roger Crawford, originally from Hanover, Massachusetts, Cape Cod surfer Jim Gilbert, and Florida surfer Carl Hatch. I also had tremendous input from Rhode Island surfer Guy Lister and Hobie's own Baby Dave Rockland. Howie Goldsmith from Goldie's Surf Shop in Rhode Island and Rick Zetterberg from New Hampshire were kind enough to help me with some of the fact-checking as well. But surfing wasn't just a sport for the guys. Annie Jones Brown and her sister Kathy Jones Nelson from Manchester, New Hampshire were just two of the many young women surfing at the time.
Our family bought a beach house back in the late 50s, and that is how we developed our love of surfing. There was a family on the beach that had a number of children, and they had an old balsa wood board, and we would take turns surfing on that. That would be my twin brother Billy and Annie, who's only a year older than us. There's a friend that surfed with us named Cindy Darlin, who went to high school and grammar school with her in Manchester. And she was a little bit shorter, so Ann was the tallest, then me, and then Cindy. Cindy always used to have this yellow and white bikini that was just awesome, and Ann had a pretty awesome bikini too.
We had jam bikinis.
In fact, that's what we wore. We just wore our bikinis.
No wetsuits,
No
folks.
wetsuits or anything like that. And we would sometimes drive up to York, Maine, or we'd go down to the Wall in Hampton looking for big waves. And I have to say, we also went surfing once right after a thunderstorm, and we could see the lightning in the background, but
that wasn't too smart.
We just thought that was great.
Super
because
glassy though,
glassy,
the waves,
and it was just beautiful.
And we came home and our folks are really mad. They're like, what are you doing out in the middle of a thunderstorm? Well, it wasn't where we were. Well, yeah.
I picked up a surfing magazine at the local drugstore and became interested in the idea of surfing. There were no surf shops around here at that time, so I ended up building my own board. I bought some foam and a redwood board to make a stringer and fiberglass and built it in my parents' basement, which they didn't like the idea of too much because of the smell. I ended up with a surfboard that I took down to Nahant Beach and kind of sort of taught myself how to surf. The board, in retrospect, turned out to be a dog. It wasn't shaped right, was too big, but I did learn how to surf on it and ended up meeting a whole bunch of nice people. A couple of the first guys that I met surfing were Mike Foss, who was a transplant from Southern California, and Junior LeBlanc, George LeBlanc Jr., who was a local guy, a sailor. And we ended up surfing up and down the New England coast and for years.
Well, I really wanted to learn about surfing, and I didn't know what to do about it. This is back when there were no surf shops, no ways to get a board. So I started going to, I was in Boston in college at the time, and I'd go to this newsstand in Harvard Square, and I'd buy every surfing magazine I could find. And simultaneously with that informational input was the Beach Boys music, and somehow this fantasy of the California lifestyle and surfing just became so powerful. Inevitably, I found two old surfboards in a basement of a marine hardware store in the waterfront in Boston. Two plastic pop-outs we bought for 60 bucks a piece. I bought them for a friend of mine and I. Took them up to a lake in New Hampshire where we spent summers, and we learned how to surf wake surfing behind the family outboard boat. So we'd take a half a dozen teenagers and stuff them in the back of the boat, make a 2-foot wave, and ride all around the lake in New Hampshire all summer long. We always rode on the right-hand side of the boat, the right-hand wake. So we were going left all the time. We weren't goofy foot, but we were going backside. We didn't know that. We just thought we were surfing. And after a summer of that, we thought we were ready to try the ocean, so we drove all the way down to the seacoast of New Hampshire that summer, thinking that we'd complete the fantasy.
I just moved to Brookline, Massachusetts, and just outside of Boston, and I passed a newsstand, and the newsstand had this black and white surfing magazine, and didn't have any friends yet because it was the first week of school. And I picked up the magazine and looked at it and said, oh, we've got better waves than this on Cape Cod. I think I'd like to do that. Of course, we used to body surf and ride our mats in all summer long when we got out to the ocean beaches on the Cape. And so I started saving money at that point, and in May of that year, we went to the opening of the World's Fair in New York, and that was the closest surf shop was in New York. And I bought a board, and they had it shipped to Cape Cod, and took the board, packed it into my 1958 Ford wagon, and started surfing.
I saw a surfing contest on television. Probably one of the first televised surfing contests. It was Makaha, I think it was 1962. And my reaction was, hey, we got bigger waves than that on the Jersey Shore. You know, probably not true, but it was what I thought. And I watched these guys on surfboards, and I said, you know, I really like to do that. And then fate stepped in, and one of my roommates from college, graduated a year after me, had been a lifeguard in Santa Monica the previous winter, and he brought back with him a surfboard. It was a red Dwayne surfboard made by Gordon Dwayne, and he was keeping it in his apartment in New York City, and the thing was so tall that it wouldn't even fit in the apartment. Ceilings were too low. So I went in there and we were talking, and I said, you know, Bob Robb, I said, I'd really like to have that surfboard because I'd really like to try it down the Jersey Shore. And he said, I might do that. He said, what do you give me for it? And I said, well, how about this old beat up French Simca that I got that's sitting out in the street? And he said, yeah, that sounds fair. So I took it down to the Jersey Shore. This is now in the spring of '63. And I actually saw two guys out in the water. And I looked at them, and they were wearing suits, but wetsuits, but they had no boots and gloves. So I said, well, I'm tougher than that. You know, I said, I'll go in. I had a bathing suit on. So I jump in the water. And of course, I didn't know about waxing the board. You know, I thought you wax the bottom like skis. So I jump in the water, and I slide off the board, and I'm freezing. So these two guys come in, Denny Devine and Jeff Slobotnik, I think was his name. I still remember them. And they said, look, you're going to kill yourself out there. It was a pretty good sized day, it was maybe 5 or 6 foot. And they said, we'll take you to Manasquan Inlet, which is a little more sheltered. And, you know, if you want to go in without a wetsuit, that's up to you, but we'll at least take you and show you how to surf. So I got in there, and I actually caught a wave. And, you know, I said, I got up, and I said, this is like flying. I said, I got to do this.
And then I'll never forget when my folks let us order a custom surfboard from the O'Neill Surf Shop in California. It came by train, and we drove down in my dad's big, huge gas guzzler station wagon, the three of us. And when they took it off the freight part of the train, we were all jumping all around and helping my father get it into the station wagon. And we wanted him to drive us right to the beach that day because we wanted to try it out. And he's like, no, you're going to go down later with your mother this weekend. So we had to wait. I think it was right when we got out of school that it came by train. And I remember taking that out, and it was kind of hard with the three of us taking turns, but somehow we managed. But taking off on that and the rides, it was blue. Royal blue
with the yellow stripe.
With a yellow racing stripe. And we thought we were, we could be in the endless summer, you know. We just really felt pretty proud of it. It was great. And who we used to surf with, Rick Zetterberg, Steve Clark, whose nickname was Spirit, Kurt Stafford. There was a whole bunch of us, and we started the Rye Beach Surf Club. You were the treasurer. I was the vice president. Zeddy was the president. And we used to go all over the place in his van.
Started surfing regularly right at Nantasket. It was about 10 miles from where I lived, and didn't really go many other places for the first year or so, until bit by bit we met surfers that lived in other areas, just adjacent beaches, and they'd invite us to come down to their beach. Think about that. They'd invite us to come down to their beach and go surfing with them. And so we spread out a little bit around the South Shore, north or south, a few miles here and there. And then beyond that, it expanded probably up into the coast of Maine and New Hampshire, Cape Cod, occasionally Rhode Island, until we began to get a flavor for, you know, what kind of different waves there were in different parts of New England. The surf scene there was pretty mellow, and people were enthusiastic to see you in the water. You were pretty much welcome everywhere you went. It was a pretty comfortable scene, and there was a camaraderie of people surfing on God knows what any kind of equipment they could get.
On the North Shore, there weren't that many surfers back then at that time. So when the surf was up and we went to one of 2 or 3 areas that we frequented, like Nahant Beach or Devereux or Good Harbor Beach up in Gloucester, there weren't really a lot of surfers, so we never got into any problems about territory or egos or anything like that. It was a pretty good bunch of people.
Les Reitman had just opened Manatee Sea Center, which was the Hobie dealer in Belmont. And I picked up a surfer magazine. I didn't know, you know, I hadn't seen it in California, I didn't know anything about it. So when I saw this surfer magazine, I didn't really even know there was any such thing. So I opened it up, and in the back there was an ad for a guy named Jim Kidd, who had started something called Malibu Surfboards. And these are polystyrene, right? Now, you know, what goes around comes around. We're that way now. So I bought 6 of them. Gus and I bought them together, and the idea was we were going to sell 3, and then we'd have, you know, 2 for us and maybe 1 for our wives to ride. I took the Malibu and started taking that down to the beach, and that whole summer, Gus and I went to Belmar, and then we started going down to Long Beach Island, because frankly the waves were a little bigger. And we got down there and went across the causeway from Manahawkin to Ship Bottom, and there's this big trailer, big semi-trailer, and on the side are in red letters is SURFBOARDS. And that was what Ron DeMena started with. He just had a little beach stand, and then about maybe 3 weeks later I saw an ad actually in one of the local beach times for Ron John. So anyway, I was working for IBM, enjoying what I was doing, and I started thinking about what the next step for me was. I met one guy who convinced me that I really ought to go back to school. I was an engineer, but I was interested in business. He said, why don't you think about going to Harvard Business School? So I applied and got in and was scheduled to go in September of 1964. And I thought to myself, you know, I probably could maybe do what Ron DeMena, who had started Ron John by that point, and Les Reitman, who started Manatee, were doing out here. Maybe I could have a chance like that in New England. So I went into Les and I said, Les, is there anybody surfing in New England? And he said, I don't know. Listen, he said, Hobie Alder and Phil Edwards and Bruce Brown are coming by. They're doing a show of the Endless Summer. Would you like to meet them? So I would say this is probably in August '64. So I was all set. So I went down there, and these guys couldn't have been nicer. Les said, this is Will. He's going to school in Boston. So I said, hey, Hobie, you got anybody selling your boards up in New England? He said, no. He said, are there any waves up there? I said, I don't know, but I'll find out. My wife and I, we flew up to Boston and came back a couple times. We kind of get used to it. And so I said, look, let's drive up. I'll put a board on the car and we'll go up and I'll get you set, and then I'll come back and get the other car. So I took the Dwayne up, and it was, I'm going to say, September 9th, 1964. And we still didn't know if there was any surf, but I said there's a south-facing beach. It's called Horseneck Beach. So we put the board on top of the VW, and we drove down to the south coast, and it was hurricane surf. It was probably 7-8 feet. The sets were very close together, but I got outside, and I started riding the waves. I think I wrote a Hobie note, and I said, yes, Hobie, there are waves in New England. And I went back to Jersey and got my other car and put the Malibu in it and started coming back up the coast to Connecticut. And I was going to find the first place that there was surf, right? So I'd come back up and I would turn off the road at every road to the beach, and there was nothing until I got to Rhode Island. So I turned off in Weekapaug and Westerly, and I really didn't see much. And then I hit a turnoff that just said Matunic Beach. So I turned in there, and I got to the end of the road, and there's a point break. A perfect reef, foiled left and right, like nothing I'd ever seen. I mean, literally, like nothing I'd ever seen in Jersey. So there were a couple guys out there, and they were riding old logs, and I took the Malibu out, and I went out to the point. It's about 600 yards offshore, and a perfect left, just, you know, building and the shoulder coming down, and you're going along. And kids on the beach, I come back in, and they said, "Where did you get that surfboard?" And I said, "What do you call this place?" And they said, "Mary's Bar." And I said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Oh, Mary's Bar," because there's Mary Cavanaugh owned the beach camp right by there. I said, "Yeah, it's Mary's Bar." I said, "Okay." I said, "What's the nearest town?" They said, "Narragansett." So I said, "I think I'll start a surf shop." So I found a building on Kingstown Road for $50 a month.
One of the local surfers in Matunic was Guy Lister. His interest in surfing began in 1963 after watching the movie Beach Party. As he told me, I grabbed every surf magazine I could find and read them from cover to cover, trying to learn everything I could about surfing as I set my goal to get a surfboard in 1964. And that goal was achieved when his dad bought him a board after graduating from junior high. He said people laughed at him that first summer when he crossed the dunes with his new board. Nobody understood at the time how big the sport was about to become. Guy eventually contacted Will Summers and became part of the Narragansett Surf Shop team. Meanwhile, back in Narragansett, Will was facing an unexpected challenge as he was about to open his new shop. Surfers were being harassed all over as towns began to restrict surfing.
There were a couple of articles in the paper, and some of the kids were talking about that surfing was going to be banned. So here I already made the commitment to rent the shop, and there was a suggestion that we were going to let anybody surf anywhere. So I wrote a letter in, I'm going to say October 1964, to the Commissioner of Parks and Recreation of the state of Rhode Island. His name was Mr. Cotter. And I said, I'd like to support that surfing is a good, healthy sport, and I think we can avoid any problems. And I think through Mr. Caswell, I met a gentleman named Cap Wheeler. And Roger Wheeler was the head of the lifeguards in Rhode Island and reported to Mr. Cotter, who was the head of the Board of Park and Recreation. And Cap and I took a liking for each other. He was probably 25 years older than I was, a very rugged guy, wore a military uniform all the time. And he said, Will, he said, I think you're on to something. He said, I think this could be a good thing. But he said, there's really nothing I can do. You have to work through Mr. Cotter and the Department of Parks. So I said, okay. So I got a letter from Mr. Cotter. Would I attend a meeting which was going to be sort of to decide the future of surfing in Rhode Island? So I go to this meeting, and there's like 100 people there. There's like 30 property owners, you know, sort of dressed up, formal-looking guys. And then there's about 70 kids, long-haired kids with skateboards and blonde hair, and they're screaming, you know, we can't play advanced surfing. So they started the meeting, and they said how it was going to run. They would give each side a chance to talk. And they said, who's going to talk for the surfers? And I said, if you want me, I will. I said, I'm planning to be in the business, and I'm interested in this, and I'd like to talk to the surfers. And I knew most of the kids by that point. So I gave my pitch, and the pitch was that surfing is a healthy sport. We generally surf in places where there are fewer bathers because, like Matunic, which was rocky, and nobody ever went out of the water there, and we'll be okay. And the beach owners kind of looked at me, you know, the beach property owners, who's this guy? But the surfers got it, and it was kind of neat because by the end of the meeting, and this is what impressed me the most, they said, well, we'll table it. We won't do anything, and maybe we'll think about setting aside specific, more rocky areas in the various parks, Scarborough being the main one near Point Judith. But what we want to do, we want to make sure there's some control. So basically, they're looking at me and they say, can you talk to these young people and see that we can all be good and get along together. And by the end of the meeting, the beachfront property owners were going to the surfers and saying, well, it looks like you guys are fairly responsible after all.
You know, kids today just take it for granted that they have access to the water. I think there's some restrictions and limitations, but they're probably pretty reasonable as compared to what we encountered when we first started. When in the very beginning there was no surfing and no restrictions. We were just a handful of guys that went out here or there, wherever we wanted to, whenever we wanted to, and there weren't enough of us to be an annoyance. But as the sport grew exponentially over the next year or two, suddenly you'd have 25 surfers in the water on what was then just a public bathing beach, and the tensions began to grow. At first we were just a novelty, I think, you know, a cute little newspaper story to see a bunch of guys out there in the winter, but pretty soon when we're sharing, you know, the 1 foot surf with a bunch of bathers, the local townspeople in Nantasket became a little offended at that, and they just didn't think that we had the right to be there.
Well, we went from being able to surf wherever we wanted to gradually being moved down the beach, from the Cable Road to the Genes Beach area down to Sawyer's Beach, which, by the way, had no waves. So we
That part of the beach didn't have a good break.
We were kind of bummed out about that, and we eventually ended up going to the Wall in Hampton, which of course you can only surf at low tide.
That had a surfing area too that wasn't very big.
And surfing at that time didn't have the greatest reputation, people were saying. You know, different things
Young
about
kids, they're crazy, they're into drugs, they were just... I remember that one year they chased with a helicopter our friend Rick Zetterberg, who was surfing outside of the surfing area.
I was out surfing one day in Indialantic, Florida, and I met these guys from Rye Beach, New Hampshire, and they invited me to surf with them at Rye, New Hampshire, on their Hobie team in the coming summer. And while there, we had this incident happen about surfing at this public beach location. And while out there surfing, these police boat came and a helicopter came over us and ordered us out of the water, as well as the police that were on the beach. And we ran for it. We went around the corner of this little bay we were in and into the bushes. And the next thing I know, I was captured by the cops along this highway.
And Zeddy somehow left his surfboard somewhere, ran through a swamp, and came to our house at the back door. And we were out on the front porch, and my father came out and said to Kathy and I, there's some guy out here who, he looks like a seaweed monster. I don't know who he is, and he says he knows you girls. You better go talk to him.
He had his black wetsuit on with seaweed all over, and he had long hair by then. His hair was as long as ours, said he. So we had to take him in our...
We brought him in, he took a shower,
and then we transported him out of Rye for a couple of days because they were looking for him. And you just look back.
But we were pretty harassed wherever we went. If you're outside of the area, oh God, you might get arrested, you might get this might happen, you get a fine.
Okay. While at the jail and a small court for the village, they contacted Mr. Zetterberg. He came down to the police station and bailed me out. And they set a court date for me, and I told Mr. Zetterberg that the court date was in the time I'd be back in Florida. I wouldn't be able to participate in being there in person. And he said, don't worry about that, Carl. We'll take care of that.
There was a bank robbery the same day they chased Rick Zetterberg all over creation in Hampton or Rye, and there were no cops to cover it because they're all out chasing him because he was surfing outside of the surfing area.
And it was the chief of police,
Officer Perry.
Officer Perry. They had all men after him, and the bank robber, I think, got away.
I remember them having meetings at the local town hall, and I'd have to put a suit and tie on, and we'd all come all dressed up, and we'd show up, and we'd try to look like we were responsible young men and women, and there'd be people from the town that were in there, and they were claiming that we brought diseases to the beach, and that one guy said he swore he saw a guy cut in half by a surfboard in Hawaii, cut right in half, and he didn't want that happening to his kids on the beach.
There was talk about restricting the area, the surfing on Cape Cod, but the geography of the territory sort of ruled against it, because the town the town beaches, the right-of-way on the national seashore, was just the width of the road, the access road that got you to the beach. And so those towns that had lifeguards, Wellfleet and Truro being among them, they would patrol just that 150 feet right of way at the end of the parking lot. And of course, it's just one beach, that's 47 miles long, I think, and every other break is as good as the last. So if there was a conflict there, if the lifeguards didn't want us surfing amongst the swimmers, we'd just walk 100 yards on the beach and we'd have another wave.
And it's so different today, because now at Rye Beach, the swimmers have like no place to swim, because the surfers are to the left or the right and you're in the middle. And there's a
swimming area and the rest is all surfing area.
So
and
it's
we're thinking,
done a 360.
why couldn't we have had that?
So we worked through it with the town, and they gave us a restricted area, and in the summertime, and they didn't care in the wintertime, and so we made the best of that. But boundaries don't work when you're chasing waves, so that we'd be outside the limits of that, and the lifeguards would chase us up and down the beach. They get tired of that. We'd get tired of being chased. Eventually, it just, water seeks its own level, and it just all sorted out. And now, 50 years later, it's not a big deal.
Officer Kendall was our nemesis. A lot of times he was the guy, that would stand and watch. You surfed outside of the surfing area, boom, he's right there, trying to arrest you, give you a ticket or whatever. Many times after we were through college, we would see him and, hi, Officer Kendall, and he'd be like, oh no, not you two again. We're like, hey, we're staying out of trouble, don't worry about it. We're surfing inside the area, but they were all over us after a couple years of surfing. There was no let up.
Unfortunately, Cindy Darland, the one that we spoke about, passed away, and we did have a paddle out for her. The Genolas, which is a family that lived right next to Cindy at her beach house at Rye, had a few small dogs, and all of a sudden, who came walking along but Officer Kendall, because he is now on dog patrol.
He graduated from Officer Kendall to Dog Patrol Kendall.
And he's still after.
And he's still
he looked at us and said, "Are you kidding me?"
Yeah,
and
we're like, hi,
"Yep."
hi, Officer Kendall. He's like, are you kidding me? No, how are you doing?
So I was living in Watertown, and I was traveling generally down to Rhode Island, because the water was a little bit warmer there. But I also went up to Cape Ann. And I saw this black thing out in the water. It was the first time I'd ever seen a guy in a full wetsuit in New England. And his name was Freddie Silton. Of course, he paddled in. So I said, what's the waves like? He says, they're pretty good. He said, they're probably better down on the other parts of the North Shore. He said, but why are you here? I said, well, I'm in school. And I said, I'm thinking about starting a surf shop. So he said, that's something I'd be a dream of mine. He'd graduate from Boston University. I said, you want to help me? He said, sure. So Fred had a group of friends, and they actually had started a surf club. It was called the Narragansett Beach Surf Club, and it was on the North Shore of Boston. And there might have been 5 or 6 of them. They're mostly old pop-outs. And one of the members of that club was a guy named Ron Paré. And Paré was a fascinating guy. He's still a friend of mine 50 years later.
I met Will Summers at Narragansett Beach. We were out surfing, 3 or 4 of us, and he came over and introduced himself to us and told us he was scouting the different areas in New England, trying to figure out where to open up a surf shop. By the time he figured out where he was going to open up his first shop, which was down in Narragansett, Rhode Island, I knew him well enough that I ended up going down there and helped him set the shop up. I used to build the racks and hardware in the shop.
I'd found a couple of good young men. Pudge Thomas was a local guy, probably 16. John Caswell, who was a little older. His father was a realtor. So I said, you guys want to work for us? So we now had a basic core. So that winter, Ronnie and Fred and Pudge and I built out the shop at 50 Kingstown Road. We were doing okay. We'd gotten in some pop-outs, and we'd written to some of the California manufacturers. I'd written to Hobie several times, got no answer. And I'd written to Jacobs and Bing Copeland and Gordon Smith, and I'd probably gotten one board from each of them, so I could say I was a dealer for these different ones. And I was kind of upset, frankly, that Hobie hadn't gotten back to me. So it got to be February. We were starting to sell some boards. Things were going pretty good. And we're sitting in the shop and working on the racks, and all of a sudden a car pulls out front, and this guy gets out, and he's got a raincoat on. It was freezing, and he's tan, and we knew he wasn't from where it was Hobie. So I said, "Hey, Hobie, how you doing?" And he said, "Hey, Will." He said, "I remember seeing you this past summer." He said, "I really apologize." I said, "I wrote to you a couple times, in fact, several." He said, "Well, I mislaid your letters." So I kind of asked him, "Well, do we have a shot at being a dealer?" He says, "Well, show me the surf." I thought that was interesting. So we took him to Matunic, and he saw a couple guys out there. We took him to Point Judith, which is killer surf. And we took him to Narragansett Town Beach, and there were a bunch of kids out there. And he looked around and watched some of the guys. And they were doing tricks, and by that time people could start doing spinners and stuff like that. And he said, "Let's go back to the shop." And I said, "Sure." So we go out to the shop. He says, "Will, can I use your phone?" I said, "Sure, Hobie." He said, "I want to call California." I said, "Sure, go ahead." So he picks up the phone and he calls Jim Galloon, who was his second in command then, and he said, "Hey Jim, I looked around, there's some guys here getting pretty good." He said, "I want you to send Will Summers 24 surfboards." And I'm nudging him, I'm hitting him. I said, "Hobie, I don't have the money to pay for 24 surfboards." And he said, "That's all right." He says, "You'll sell them." And I did. I told Hobie that I would be exclusive. We would not carry anybody else's boards for sale other than his after I got rid of my Ricks and Gordon Smiths and Dwayne's. And so that was okay. But I said, "Hobie," I said, "it really doesn't make sense for me to rent your boards. They're just too nice and too precious." So we made our own rental boards. We always did that. And also we decided to make our own skateboards. So that's kind of how I got interested in woodworking. Ronnie and I bought a shaper blade, and we have a pattern, and we made about a couple thousand skateboards. There were Summers and Pari as a brand, and they had rock wheels on them. I still have one, and we used to sell them in all the shops and ride them. And I remember going down Beacon Hill in Boston, which is a pretty gnarly hill, and just coming down the whole thing on that skateboard. I think I wore the wheels out between the top and the bottom. The other thing we did, since we had blanks available to us, we actually laminated fins to them, little bitty wood fins, and we'd take them out to the dunes out on the Cape, and we'd ride them down the dunes. You don't make any money selling surfboards. Okay, so I'll give you the economics of it at that time. We paid Hobie about 120 bucks. We got a 20% discount off face, so we sold that surfboard between $100 and $155. Okay, maybe we got a little bit for the freight, but at 20% on something that costs a teenager a lot of money, you're not going to make any money. So we knew, and Hobie knew, that you made your money on clothes and accessories, skateboards, jams, stuff like that. So one of the things we did was early on was get an arrangement with Hang Ten Surfwear. And of course we bought all our jackets from them and stuff like that. But that's where you make your money. Clothing now you make 40%. Now I gotta remember I'm a business school student. I know all this stuff, right? So we bought in the clothes and we would sell out on the clothes. I'd sell all the surfboards, but we would sell out on the clothes. We made a lot of money from rentals. We'd rental for an hour for $9. I mean, believe it now, what is it, 30 bucks an hour or something like that. We made a lot of money on lessons, even in those days.
Howard Goldsmith was a dealer for Dewey Weber, Hanson, and Gordon Smith surfboards, originally out of Cranston, Rhode Island, and later Narragansett and Newport Beach. He is credited with holding the first New England Championships in Narragansett, Rhode Island in May 1965, drawing a large crowd of spectators for which the town was not fully prepared.
You don't build a market unless you have competition. That's one thing I learned in business school, and it's absolutely true. So we were very fortunate in that there was a guy in Cranston, Rhode Island. His name was Howard Goldsmith, but he called himself Goldie, who had started a surf shop. And Goldie was a pusher. He was a promoter too. So we really were good foils for each other because I was beachfront and he was inland, but he had the population around him. And one of the things he did was run a couple of spots on a little radio station in Rhode Island. And I tell you what, for me, I'm a competitive guy. Hearing somebody else having ads on the radio was kind of a big deal. So I talked to Hobie and I said, what do you think we ought to do? He says, well, why don't you run a surfing contest? He says, you're right down by the beach, you can't hurt. So by that time, I had corresponded with Hoppy Swartz. And I'd said, Hoppy, we need some help on setting up these beaches and getting permission for it. And he said, that's no problem. I called him up on the phone and we exchanged letters. And he said, I'll appoint you the director of District 7 of the United States Surfing Association for New England. And you can run whatever kind of contest you want. So that worked. So I talked to the beach commission. I said, are you okay with us running a surf contest in Narragansett? And they said, yeah, well, you gonna run it? Yeah, you gonna administer it? I said, yeah, we got our people and we'll monitor it. And Goldie was gonna have a team there and stuff like that, so everybody was coming. And I had the idea that I was gonna go Goldie one better. So I called up the radio station WPRO, which was the 50,000 watt major teenage radio station in Rhode Island. And I said, can I talk to whoever runs the programming for the teenage radio stuff? And they said, well, his name is Al Herskovitz, and you're welcome to talk to him. So I said, Mr. Herskovitz, I said, my name's Will Summers. I started a surf shop down in Narragansett. I said, would you want to get involved with surfing? It's kind of the hot thing, and you're running a lot of these records by the Beach Boys and Jan and Dean and stuff like that. He said, that sounds good. I said, why don't you set up maybe one of your disc jockeys to specialize in this? He said, I got the perfect guy. His name is Joe Thomas. We'll call him Surfer Joe, because of course the Surfer Joe song was very popular then. And I said, oh, that'd be good. I said, would you help promote this surfing contest for us? The Rhode Island Championships is what we called it. I could do that because of the USA affiliation. And they're plugging it between every record. So Surfer Joe's coming on and he's saying, we're running this surf contest, you have to get down there. So now this got Goldie going. So he said, we're gonna win this contest. And he brought a guy named Will Needs, who was from California. Here we are at the beach in Narragansett, and we got about 5,000 people there. And the people in town are going crazy, How are we gonna have them park? What's going on? On the other hand, they loved it because the people are all buying hot dogs and hamburgers. And of course, we loved it because they're coming to our surf shop and renting boards and buying boards and everything like that. So Will was the best surfer on that small surf, and that day he won the contest. Hobie judged, and he was very critical. If somebody was faking it, you weren't gonna put anything past him. So I go back to Herskovitz and I said, can we run a New England championship? Because it's been so successful for both of us. Then Hobie said, Will, I've got this deal with Vitapack. We're doing these skateboards. And he said, would you be interested if I sent Dave Rockland back with the Hobie skateboard team? Would you be able to do some promos for us and stuff like that? And I kind of knew what I was doing by that point. I knew how to deal with radio stations and stuff like that. So I called WBZ in Boston. And I said, gentlemen, we're bringing the Hobie skateboard team in from California. Would you be interested in doing some promos for that? And Boston had kind of turned us down. We'd wanted to run contests in Massachusetts. And we don't know anything about surfing. In Massachusetts, you might be kidding. But skateboarding was coming on. And there were a bunch of talks about skateboard bands and stuff like that. We'd fought that. So Hobie says they're coming on a certain day. So Marilyn and I went to Logan Airport outside of Boston, and off walks this guy about my size with a jam hat and a bunch of other stuff, and he comes off the plane, and behind him are 4 little kids, 14, 13, 12, and 10. And this is the Hobie skateboard team. So we said, well, we don't know where to put you up. And they said, well, we don't care, we'll sleep on your floor. So the 4 Hobie skateboard team slept on the floor of our apartment in Watertown, Massachusetts. And they were great. And the thing I remember was when they got off the plane, so in those days you could go down to the gate. It wasn't like you have TSA and stuff like that today. So they got off and they sat down and they said, we're not going out until we take the rock wheels off our skateboards and put gel wheels on, because we're going to skate out of the terminal. we took them down to Paragon Park, which is in Hull, Massachusetts, in Nantasket, and we put on a demo, and there was, hundreds of people there. They were fantastic. Torge's father was a lawyer. The other two boys were Stevie and Davy Hilton. They were, I guess they're Paris Hilton's uncle, to put it into today's context, but they were Nicky Hill's sons. We also brought them down to Rhode Island. Now I have to explain about Dave Rockland. Dave's called Baby Dave, and his uncle is Dave Rockland also, who was a really famous surfer back from the 30s. So David had gone to Hawaii and he started a company called Surfline Hawaii, which is still around. It's run by Pooh Rockland and his son. And they made the first jams. These were flowered bathing suits. So David had one of these on and he had a jam hat. And he said, you got to get these jams. I said, David, boys in New England are not going to wear flowered bathing suits. Will, you got to get them. You got to do this. So he said, I'll call my uncle. I'll send you 2 dozen. I said, all right. I said, I'll never sell 2 dozen, but anyway, we'll do it. And you got to get 6 jam hats. I said, David, jam hats? No way, just 6, get 6. So we had them air freighted in. Ronnie Parry comes out, and he's as much about a man's man as anybody you'll ever see. And he puts a jam hat on. In those days we wore tikis, that was a thing we sold, and the jams, and he kind of announces to the ocean, he didn't really do anything, he goes, the jams are here. And I was out surfing, and I just said, oh yeah, well great. I said, I'll just keep going. And so I surfed for another hour or so, and I come back to the shop. I said, how do we do? We sell any jams? He said, they're all gone. I said, what? He said, we sold them all. And the jam hats too, they're all gone. So I called Surfline Hawaii and I said, send me 6 dozen. They were gone in 2 weeks. So I said, call back, and now it's like August. I said, send me a gross, which is 144 pairs. So they were, I think by the end of the season I had 2 left. So I was totally wrong, and I always like the story when I'm wrong the best. And jams did sell, and boys in New England did wear bathing suits and flowers.
I think I was 16 when I got a jam dress. And Kathy and I both wore jam bikinis, we had jam hats. And I think it all started when Will started bringing some of the people up from California to perform surfing and just getting to meet us on the team. But that was the craze back then with the fashion. It was all about jams, colorful, flower power.
The big hat, they had like big felt hats that had flowers on them. And I know in college that they'd have fraternity parties, and a lot of times the theme would be surfing or the beach or whatever, and we just...
Where did you get those clothes,
We just
girls?
loved wearing our jam
beach.
clothes with everything. We just thought they were great, and the more colorful they were, the better they looked.
In the late winter of 1965, early 66, we got a request, and by the way, we were getting pretty well known by this, and would we give a skateboard presentation at Benoit's department store in Portland, Maine. So we piled in the hearse and we drove up in the snow to Portland, Maine. This was Cindy, Annie, Kathy Jones, Annie's sister, and Chip Chappell. So there were 5 of us. Now I would have to basically swear on the Bible that these gals were going to come home okay when I did this. I never forget Linda Peters' mom, because we would take Linda Peters from the Bikini Surf Shop with us too. And her mom looked me right in the eyes and said, Willard, if anything happens to these girls, you're dead meat. And I took that very seriously. So we went up to Benoit's in Portland, and we put on our demo, and we talked about surfing and clothes and skateboards and all that. And the 2 girls went home. I dropped them off in Manchester, New Hampshire, which is where they lived during the winter. And they had about 10 phone calls in an hour. We saw you on Channel 8 in Portland. You were on TV. It was such a big deal. A couple other things happened along the road here, because I love to write, and I wanted to inform the world on how great New England surf was, and I felt special about it, and we thought it was very unique. So what I did was I wrote an article, and it was called Little Rhode Island is Big on Surf, and Ronnie did the pictures, and some of them are well known too, And we got it in an article, in an issue, I believe it was November '65.
I never competed. I ended up judging several contests. The New England Surfing Championships that we had at First Beach in Newport. There was a couple of contests down in Narragansett, Rhode Island that I judged.
While it was very difficult for us to win the men's, because the other shops, Goldie in Rhode Island and our competition in Massachusetts, which was equally important, was Dave Williams, who owned the Weber shop in Hull when we finally set the shop up there. But we knew we could do something with the women's because there were no import women, from California. So that summer, we were really lucky. First, we got some of the girls from Rhode Island who were pretty good. Goldie had Sue Lloyd, who's now Sue Lloyd Hogan, who runs Warm Winds. She was very good, but we were able to get a couple of young women, Beth Weiner and Nancy Buchanan, who could at least give her some competition. So we were kind of on an even playing field until we went up to New Hampshire.
There were these two gals from New Hampshire that Will had met up there. And they were pretty good surfers, and they were doggone good looking. A couple of really cute gals. And they were really enthusiastic, and eventually when I finally got to get up there and meet them, it was every bit as good as I'd heard of. These gals could surf.
We had a New Hampshire Open, which started in 1965, I believe it was.
T-shirt,
yeah, T-shirt, where we had our first surfing contests, and New Hampshire really was on the map.
While we were having the shop in Narragansett in early 1965, we always had in mind to have several. This is important to us because, it was part of my business exercise with being in business school and making this stuff happen, was to have other shops. And one of the kids that hung around the shop in Narragansett was a young man named Steve Bell. I didn't have a job for him in Narragansett. I said, would you be interested in starting a shop up in Massachusetts? So the shop we created was on the side of the road in Hyannis, Mass. And Steve Bell ran it. And it really didn't have much of a good result. I'd go up there myself, and I couldn't sell anything either. So I decided that we'd close it. But on one of those trips back and forth to the Cape to go to that place, I happened to see a hearse. A 1938 Cadillac hearse sitting by the side of the road in a town called Ware, Massachusetts. So I stopped by the guys and I said, anybody want to sell that hearse? And they said, yeah, well, we'll get rid of it. Didn't ask me what I wanted to do with it. So I said, well, I'll buy it for you. How much you want? $250. So I bought the hearse. I had Hobie Hearse, which is a terrible pun, hobby horse, put on the side of it and the shop address. And that became our official surf vehicle.
It became such a hit that it almost took on a life of its own. I used it myself for the Nahant Beach Surf Club to take some of those guys out to Nantucket Island for a couple of days to do some surfing. It was a lot of fun.
The hearse had a long history before I got there, colorful history, I'm sure. And then it sort of came into my possession, and it was a real love-hate relationship with me and the hearse in the beginning. I wasn't too sure about this thing. It was a hearse. And but eventually I got comfortable with it, and it was a lot of fun riding around in the thing. And we would load it up with boards and kids, and we'd take off and go to a contest, and we looked like a bunch of clowns coming out of a Volkswagen when 15 guys would come roaring, and women would come out of the back of the hearse at Newport or Narragansett to compete down there. And it always got stares, and upstanding parents weren't too thrilled about their daughters riding around the hearse with us after dark.
In 1965, as a 25, 26-year-old, parents were entrusting me with their 17 and 16-year-old sons and daughters, and I took that responsibility very seriously.
And I remember meeting the Narragansett Surf Shop hearse in the parking lot across from the Dunes Hotel, and we were out there surfing, and all of a sudden this black hearse came up.
Pulled in, and we're
and these guys got out,
funeral?
and they're like, we started talking to them, they started talking to us, and whatever, but that was our first meeting, and it was just the coolest car. Well, it was a hearse, but with big yellow letters that said Narragansett Surf Shop.
Yeah. the Hobie Hearse.
So we were pretty
And that's how we met them.
That's how we met Will.
They're like, you girls are looking pretty good out there. And
would
we
you
were
like
kinda
to be on a team?
Are you
And I'm
talking
like,
to us? And the next thing you know, we were surfing with them, and I don't know, maybe a year or so later, we were on Will's team and went all up and down the East Coast with him in the hearse, just competition. It was great.
I'm not too sure about that thing. I had to sleep in it once. I thought I was going to have to sleep in it once when I delivered some boards down to Narragansett. And so I put my sleeping bag in the back, went down to Narragansett, delivered some boards, and didn't spend the night. And you know, about a half an hour in the back of the thing, I couldn't get to sleep. You know, purple curtains, purple velvet everywhere, big rollers for the caskets on the floor. I couldn't do it.
I talked about Hobie coming in for that contest in June, and I talked about him sending the skateboard team, but I left out one important part, because in between there he said, I'm going to keep sending people as long as you're okay with it. This is still in 1965. So the next guy that came was Mickey Munoz. And we never really met anybody like him. And now, we knew Hobie and we knew he was a legend, but Munoz was really a legend, right? He'd been Gidget's stunt double in the Gidget movie. So this guy comes, he's about 5'2", and he's elegant. He's as smooth a surfer still to this day as I've ever seen. Still surfs, by the way. So he shows up, and we go to Matunic, and he liked the wave. But he was so cool with the locals. He never chewed anybody out. He never bullied anybody. But if you wanted to take off in front of him, he'd just go, hey. And you look around, and he was gone. Let's just say that Mickey knew how to party. And he took Freddie and I don't remember who else, maybe Ronnie and I out to an inn down by Point Judas. And we weren't big drinkers. We liked to rock and roll and stuff like that, but we were easy. And he said, well, he said, we're going to have a good time tonight. And he said, I want you to get all my friends here Black Russians.
Mickey introduced me to Black Russians and Tequila Sunrise. We had a good time.
Will Summers asked me to be on the surf team at the Hobie surf team for, I guess it's the New England surf team, is because he had the franchise for New England. And so I started surfing in contests. And for being on the team, I got a surfboard, which I think I had just bought at cost. Will said that a group of guys from the team would deliver the board to me in Provincetown, and they weren't arriving until like 11:30, 12 o'clock one night, and I knew what they would be traveling in. The hour arrived, and I'm sitting there waiting for this, rig to pull into the parking lot, below the Provincetown Monument, and here it comes. And I started waving, hey guys, so excited. This is going to be my first Hobie, and I was going to meet other guys on the team that I hadn't met before, and the car pulls up right next to me, and the door opens, and I look in the window, and my God, it's Mickey Munoz, who at the time was on the national Hobie team. The window was open, and he sticks his hand out, and we shake, and he's asking me how the surf is, and what's going on, and all of a sudden I hear like rain. And then I look down and I realize that all the time he's been talking to me, he's been peeing. And the pee, of course, is like falling all over my sneakers. My feet are drenched in Mickey Munoz's pee, and that was my introduction to the Hobie surf team. And then the next day we went out, and the surf was great, and so I got to surf with those guys, and it was a good 4 or 5 foot day, and everybody was stoked about how great the waves were on Cape Cod.
While attending Harvard Business School in 1965, Will applied classroom theory to his new business on a daily basis. As a former engineer at IBM, he was now using punch cards to track his inventory. Who did that in 1965? But Will had always been curious about how things worked. He grew up building and racing hot rods. At a very young age, he was already influenced by the power of movies and music. Now, as a surf shop owner, those same medias were influencing the surfing world. Will had a vision and could see that surfing was not a fad like the hula hoop. He wanted to be prepared. He wanted to understand the manufacturing processes associated with his new business. Finally, a time came when Will had to write his graduate thesis at Harvard, and of all things, he chose Hobie surfboards as his case study. And as Hobie's guest in December 1965, Will worked in various parts of production, and surprisingly, Hobie actually opened up his books to Will for use in his graduate work.
Out there, I got into Grubby Clark's factory, which he really was, he didn't like to have people go in there, but I got to see what he was doing. And then in the Hobie factory, I learned how to gloss, I learned how to glass. I mean, we were doing our own repairs, but I really learned how to do it in the quality manner that he had. Hobie was an interesting guy. He had been very much of a mentor to me. He said, you can't sell from an empty wagon. Be sure you treat other people well too, so pay your bills. Promote, promote, promote. And he lived by those things, and I did, and all the other businesses I did through the years, I was grateful to Hobie for that advice. So we were out there, and we were working in the factory, and the shop rat at that time was Corky Carroll. He had a car, and Hobie for the 2 weeks loaned us that car. It was a station wagon. I was using it to go surfing. And one night we'd gone down to Salt Creek or something like that, and we were coming back to the shop in Dana Point, and it was raining. My wife was in the car, and we didn't notice anybody. And I come into the shop the next morning, and everybody looks at me. Fink, you East Coast Fink. I said, what'd I do? They said, you passed Corky in his own car. He was hitchhiking by the road, and you didn't pick him up. The guys in that shop were great. Danny Bronner, who was a fantastic glasser. The Patterson brothers. Parker was a great shaper. I mean, these guys couldn't have been kinder to me.
So after 2 weeks of training in California and Christmas dinner with the Hobie family, Will was back in Massachusetts working on his thesis and putting his plan into action.
So we had the shop that we rented for $50 in Rhode Island. I found one for $85 in Boston. I moved into the high rent district. And I rented it. This was literally a beachfront property. It looked out on the beach in Hull, Massachusetts. So what we did is, again, Pudge came up from Rhode Island and Ronnie came down, and Freddie and we built the shop in Hull. And that shop was quite successful. We had Dave Williams there, who was the Weber dealer. So we had the Hobie shop and the Weber shop. So it was the same kind of competitive situation we had between the Hobie and Weber dealer down in Rhode Island. We were right near the Surf nightclub, which is a big deal in the Boston area, a guy named Bill Spence. And the 67, the Doors played there and everything like that. It was really the premier nightclub on the beach around Boston. And the music was so loud that we'd be in the shaping room or making rental boards or patching in the back room. And, you know, we'd go into the thing and they'd say, what are those funny fumes? It was fast dope from the rest. And we'd go over to hear music and come back.
There was no surf shop on the beach when I started surfing there, and then when somebody said the Hobie shop opened up on the beach, well, that was about as good as it got. So I had to go over and check it out, and then I became so enthusiastic about the place, I would go in every weekend and check it out. And I discovered that it was a bit of a social scene as well. You know, there would be every Saturday afternoon, there'd be 5 or 10 or so really interesting guys, including Will and the guys that worked for him, that were hanging around talking about surfboards. This place is, what a great place, you know, to be at my time in the sport, where I was just really trying to get all the information I could. So I'd hang around there, and eventually, at some point in time, I studied business management in college. Will offered me a job working part-time in the shop, so that was really cool. Now I find myself on the inside of this really great situation, this great scene, and that was really, I felt really special and very honored, actually, quite surprised at having that opportunity to be there. Phil Edwards, who was the supreme god of surfing at that moment in time, history of surfing, came out to do a promotional visit to the shop and spent a weekend with us. And I was in absolute awe. I was only working as a part-timer weekends in the shop, but spent both days and had dinner a couple of times with Will and Phil Edwards. And I was going to buy a new board anyway, because I was still riding a god-awful pop-out, so I was ready to buy a new Hobie, seeing as I worked in the Hobie shop. So over dinner and at the shop the next day, Phil Edwards designed a board for me. And I wanted something like the Phil Edwards model, but I wanted, instead of a 3-stringer clear board, I wanted a 5-stringer 1/8 redwood board. And it had a concave nose in it because it just had come out. Phil Edwards and Mickey Munoz had just developed the concave nose, so I added a red translucent tail block, red translucent sandy bank fin, and when it finally showed up at the shop about 3 or 4 months later, it was the most expensive board I remember ever seeing in the shop.
I wanted to do really good inventory control for all these accessory items, so I made my poor wife keep track of everything, so she'd have to do it. And it was in a book, and then I would take it to Baker Library, and there were unit record punch card machines underneath there. And I would punch it all in, and I remember I had decks like this big. So that way I could go to Industrial National in Providence and say, here are my actual financials. In other words, it wasn't made up. And you know, I think that my professors liked that they liked this guy was actually living, he was doing what he was learning. And between that and the hearse, because they laughed at that hearse, I would drive that hearse into the Harvard parking lot, and nobody ever seen anything like it, you know, Hobie hearse on the side. So I ended up, I was graduated with distinction. I always thought they took pity on me. At that point, we had 2 shops, and we'd made some money, but you know, again, I tried to approach this as a business person. So I decided I would go to a bank and actually borrow some money. I think it's maybe one of the first surf shops that ever did that. So I made a typical business school prospectus and put in some of my stuff about working in the factory for Hobie. And I went down to Industrial National in Providence, leading bank there. And I said, I want to end up with 5 surf shops, and I'm going to need to borrow some money to do that. So I borrowed $12,500, which for me in 1966 was a lot of money. And now we were able to open a shop in Newport. And we had a lot of customers who would come to us from Newport over to Narragansett as we run these contests. And this was our first experience with, I guess you'd call them the ritzy people from Newport. And I'd sold a board to Bertie Pell, who was Claiborne Pell's son, the U.S. Senator from Rhode Island. I'd sold a board to Arthur Little, who was Royal Little's son, the chairman of Textron. But what got interesting was I sold a board to a young lady named Betsy Palmer. And she was the sportscaster, Bud Palmer's daughter, who had been a very famous player with the Knicks. And he'd married a woman named Daisy Driver, and they had a lovely home in Newport. But this girl was good, and so we ended up putting her on the surf team too. So we put a shop in at Quidnick Avenue. And I hired a guy named Dave Jenkins, who was a Newport local, to run it. So now we had 3 permanent shops. These were year-round, and we were doing pretty well. The Newport shop was a success. We had a lot of competition right away over there because Newport was a town with a lot of money in it. And then we opened the 2 summer shops, the one in Rye Beach, New Hampshire, which was actually owned by Rick Zetterberg, but which we franchised. I was thinking ahead, and we franchised the Narragansett Surf Shops name and let him use Hobie boards with Hobie's approval. And then we set up one at Coast Guard Beach in Nauset, Massachusetts.
Jim Gilbert's a neat guy. Jim had been in the shop working for Will when I came aboard, and he really enjoyed Cape Cod. So when Will opened up a shop on Cape Cod, that was the perfect thing for Jimmy to do.
It was right at the Rotary at Orleans, just as all the traffic on Route 6 comes to the Outer Cape. It went right, so it was a perfect location, and he gave us the hearse to drive around in to sort of drum up some publicity, and it was on our last legs. We put in 5 gallons of gasoline, which would last us about a day, and a quart of oil.
Will had graduated from Harvard and had moved on to a job in Pennsylvania, I believe it was. Somebody needed to take over the management of all the shops, and that person was Freddie Silton. So I managed one shop, and that was a year-round shop, and the Narragansett and Newport were also year-round shops. I think Rye Beach and the Cape were summer shops only. But Fred was the manager of all the shops, so he would keep it all together on that end. Fred went out to California one winter to spend some time out there with the Hobie guys and see how that was going. I think he liked it a lot out there and wanted to go back and live out there. So I inherited Fred's job, and so I became the manager of the 5 shops, and that was pretty interesting because that's a lot of territory and a lot of responsibility for a kid in his mid-20s.
When we started running contests, we got a lot of press, a lot of enthusiasm from the media and stuff like that. And the one article they ran, which was really front page sports section in the Providence Journal, the headline was "Cult Has Harvard Leader." It was a cult? I mean, really. We ran a Connecticut Invitational in 1966 in Matunic, Rhode Island. It was in March. And it was promoted on the radio, sure, and it was in the papers. I believe there were 1,000 teenagers sleeping on that beach at 4 o'clock in the morning. They wanted to be there when the surf contest kicked off. In 1966, I was asked to come back and be the moderator, whatever, for this New England Surf Championships, which was to be held in Newport, Rhode Island. So Hobie was coming, Dewey Weber was coming. It was going to be a big deal. Listen, by the time we were selling probably 1,200, 1,500 boards a year, maybe more. So I came back, and a lot of our promotion techniques still worked. We had WPR promoting it, and I ended up with a bullhorn in my hand. And anytime that happens, you got to watch out, because so I presented the contest. We ran it. It went off flawlessly, and we had our team competing. And the guy who surfed the best was a young man from Newport, Portuguese heritage. You got to understand, Newport was very much town gown. You had the ritzy people and you had the regular. And Chuck Almeida was the guy who bridged both teams. Everybody respected him, everybody liked him. And he won the junior men's, and he won it hands down. He was 5 feet, toes on the nose, in the curl. It was the best wave in the contest. It was a solid 10 all the way across. So I got to announce the results. And I'm on the mic, and there's probably 10,000 people there. And I said, the winner of the junior men's surfing competition today, Newport's own Chuck Almeida! And the crowd just went wild. You know, that was my first experience with doing something like that with a huge crowd. So it was kind of a cool thing. So we were fortunate, and each of our shops had its own team. Now together we were all the Narragansett Surf Shops team, but there was a team in Rhode Island, there was a team in Newport, there was a team in Massachusetts.
Well, we morphed from the Rye Beach Surf Club to the Hobie Surf Shop, and then to the Narragansett Surf Team.
There was a team from Place Cove, which was halfway to Hampton, that we competed with. And they usually rode Dewey Weber boards, and there was a man, Randy Radcape, who owned a restaurant, and he also sponsored the team.
Chris and Dara Kelly were the two girls on the Place Cove.
The team in New Hampshire was Ann Jones, Cindy Dolan, and Steve Clark, and then Rick Zetterberg. So that was the New Hampshire team. In Massachusetts, it got very interesting. So we picked a couple of guys from the North Shore, Pete Doobie and Mike Foss, who were the best surfers up there. And then we found a couple of kids on the South Shore who were older, and they were really good too. One guy was a guy named Ditto Cornwell, and his father was the vice president of Dole Pineapple. So he lived in Hawaii as a young person and then moved back to Boston. He was good. And his buddy was a guy named Jim Gilbert.
I went on to have a lot of, competitive success with the Hobie team, and had a 3A ranking for a couple of years, and got to qualify for the East Coast Surfing Championships, which was a big deal.
And then we found two younger guys. One was a pair of brothers named Jim and John Flynn, and they both worked in the shop and surfed for us.
Zeddy actually made my board. I was dating a guy at the time, and for a birthday present,
Custom made.
he had a custom board made for me and had my initials KJ. And I guess there was a little marijuana leaf there, which I was not partaking of that, but it was on the surfboard.
People were like, hey, you're cool.
I think it's really important if you're trying to paint a picture of surfing in the early years, in the 1960s. Really important to remember that it took place in the 60s. This was an era unlike anything that I think we've experienced in generations, perhaps, where there's so much time, so much change happened in such a condensed period of time. if you have to think about the 1950s, it's black and white. You know, Eisenhower was president, the war was just over. The 60s is in just vivid Technicolor, I think, if people look back on it. I do that way, and just vibrant and alive. And with the introduction of surfing running concurrent to that, I think that the environment was just ripe for surfing to be there and just get on the fast track. I don't think surfing would have fast tracked like that before or since, but the 60s enabled so much to happen. Music, sex, drugs, rock and roll, civil rights, women's rights, protest movements, an incredible war in Southeast Asia that had divided the country, change, fast change, rapid change. And surfing was just flying along with all that. So it all happened within the context of that. And it was just one part of a big, colorful puzzle.
The mid-60s were kind of a crazy time. And surfing kind of fit in there because it was such a high and there was so much energy attached with you know, riding waves and doing something that was cool, you know, culturally, you know, a cool thing to do.
In '66, I had this opportunity to basically be given part of a furniture company up in Vermont. And I decided that was what I was going to do. And then the fall of '66, we started having some problems. And it actually happened in the whole shop, and it was something that shocked us. I got a call from Roger. He said, I have a problem. He said, one of the young people involved with the shop is getting a package every day from California. And I thought it was surf wax, and I opened it up. And it was Legend drugs, uppers and downers, no hard drugs. And he said, what do I have to do? What do I do? I said, you fire them all. Well, they're some of our best guys. I said, Roger, I don't care. You got 10-year-old kids on that team. You got to make a change. And I started thinking about what I was involved with. And I said, you know, I don't know that I can manage this remotely. And I said, I'm thinking I'm going to sell the Rhode Island shops. You know, work something out in Massachusetts. I owed Hobie like 20 grand or 15 anyhow. So I had an offer on the shops in Rhode Island for 20 grand so I could liquidate my debt to Hobie and get square out of here. And maybe I was safer not being in the business that was turning dark. That's what I did.
The story about who owned and operated the original Narragansett Surf Shops sometimes becomes unclear because there were a number of Wills on the surfing scene during the startup in New England. And Will Spicer was an important part of the continuation of the Narragansett Surf Shop name in Rhode Island.
There were 5 Wills who were involved to a greater or lesser degree with surfing in New England. There was me, Will Summers, that started Narragansett Surf Shops, but there was also a guy named Will Spicer, who was the guy, he and his brother, that actually sold the surf shops to, so they owned the Hobie shops in Rhode Island for a couple of years. There was Will Jacobs, who owned, I think it was called Dive and Surf in Hartford, Connecticut. It wasn't really a surf shop, but his name was Will. There was Will Sanford, who was a California transplant, great surfer from Santa Cruz, who ended up surfing. Matunic taught us a ton of things about it. He's one of the best surfers I've ever seen. And then there was Will Needs, who was the Californian who won the contest there. So to me, it's interesting that in a time when there weren't that many people named Will, there were a bunch of Wills in surfing in New England. I think if you're going to be a success in business of any kind, you got to be passionate about it. And I was about for surfing, and that I really did believe it was a healthy sport, which made it very easy to promote to the county and the state. But more than that, I loved the kids. I was 25, going on 26. The kids were mostly teenagers. I did feel a responsibility for them.
We were at the beginning of the Beach Boys and the surfing safaris and going to Newport Beach for the regionals and whatever, and it was just a wonderful part of our lives and a great time to grow up.
One of the best part of our lives was surfing, yeah, definitely. And the friends and fresh air, sunshine. Ron Parry was part of the entourage with Will Summers. He was the photographer that took a lot of pictures. And I don't know if he was always up and ready to do things, but ole pare is how we would address him.
Surfing for me was fun while it lasted. The people I met, the work that I did, I kind of stretched myself in surfing as a sport, and it was good. It was an experience. Look back on it very fondly.
One of the things that I liked that gave me a big charge when I was, in my early days of surfing was going to the contests that I was invited to surf in through surfing on the Narragansett Surf team, the Hobie team. Because there wasn't much communication between, the beaches, the regions were pretty separate from each other. There wasn't a whole lot of crossover. So when I went down to Rhode Island to surf in the New England Surfing Championships or the Matunic Championships, or the great contests that they used to have there, I really wanted to see how the other guys were surfing, and what I could learn from them, and what they were like. Were they like hardcore? Were they into drugs? Were they so it was kind of a cultural exchange, these surf contests, and every once in a while, Hobie would drag Gary Proper up from Florida and give him a sort of a chance to demonstrate it, in between heats at one of the big contests down there, and that was always fun to be able to see them. I met Corky Carroll that way, but it was just like just feeling a part of a bigger phenomenon. I mean, what we had in the Cape was just so pure and so insular and so much fun, and it was our spot. But we also knew that the larger world of surfing was around there, and we didn't really know that much about it other than the surf movies, the Bruce Brown movies that we used to see.
Will became very good friends with our parents, and he was sort of like part of the family, and my parents trusted him, and we did too, and we just...
and that's why we got to go everywhere with him on all these fabulous trips.
And we built a great relationship with him, which we still have to this day.
For those young people, it was a chance to innovate. It was a chance to meet some people that were fascinating, guys like Hobie and Munoz and Rockland, some of us, and they got a chance to be the best.
Those are my wonder years, the 60s. I've had a great life and fascinating life, but those were the wonder years.
As the Narragansett Surf Shops disappeared from the scene, longboarding and skateboarding, as they were known at the time, went out of style as well. But competition continued through it all. The long-standing East Coast Surfing Championships, which started in 1963 in Virginia Beach, continued on. But by 1968, the USSA on the East Coast was giving way to the Eastern Surfing Association, which held their first sanctioned event in 1968 in Wrightsville Beach, North Carolina. I hope you've enjoyed some of the stories from a few of the surfers associated with the original Narragansett Surf Shops. Surfing affected them throughout their lives, carrying them to distant spots, always looking to expand their horizons. This is Will Lucas, copyright owner of the phrase, "Where there's a will, there's a wave," signing off.
Waves that rock so our foot don't slip when we slide into another cool ride. And we'll be cruising down the line. We're just chilling in the bright sunshine, watching our worries fade away while we drift into another place where the sand meets the sea. There's no better place for you and me. We'll be so happy because we're just laughing and we're living a life. And we'll be cruising down the line. We're just chilling in the bright sunshine, watching our worries fade away while we drift into another place where the sand meets the sea. There's no better place for you and me. We'll be so happy because we're just laughing